Hey there, you're watching Bare Knuckle Binder. Welcome to the channel. I had a different idea for a video this week, but I got a problem on my hands right now and I figured this would make a more interesting video. So we'll get to the other one later. Right now we got to deal with this. All right, I came out to the truck last night to get something out of it and I noticed there's a huge puddle of gear oil right underneath the transfer case. So we can get to the bottom of this. Coming to the other side of the truck for some better lighting. You can see this puddle of SAE 140 on the ground here. It's coming out of this front axle drive. Now, I don't know if you can see that on video, but you see how that it's got too much play in it. I hadn't been running the front axle drive shaft, and I actually put it on there this week. Since that output shaft is loose, the weight of the drive shaft apparently has wallered out the seal and now it's leaking like a sieve. There's two ways I can go about this. One, I can take the whole axle declutcher off. That's this section from right here to right here. This whole thing just comes off separately off a T32. But I might be able to drop this drive shaft and then see if I can tighten that, just to tighten it up, because it's got two sets of bearings on the inside. Actually, let's just take this thing all the way apart. I got to drain the transfer case no matter what. I might as well pull it apart. I think I could explain it better by showing you how this thing tightens. So it's kind of a funky little design. It's kind of like a wheel bearing in there. So let's pull this apart because we've got more T32 stuff to do, and this might help us all understand it a little better. Okay, so I'm going to yell over the fans. There's an AC unit right behind the camera and there's two fans right down here beside me. But this is what the front axle declutcher looks like. That's the inside of it. This goes back and forth with the shift fork there. So that's engaged, that's disengaged or declutched. So to take this all apart, I have to remove it from the front. So I have to get this guy out of here and pull the yoke. And then I can pull these seals in the seal housing. And then we can see the inside of it. All right, so I haven't got it all the way apart. I got the seal housing off, got the yoke obviously, and the nut and everything out. Now, on the parts manual for a T32, a very general one, not this exact model of T32, but a sub-model later years, is available online. And on every page of this thing, it says replace any gaskets with sealant. And I, just looking at this thing and guessing, I'll take it apart some more so you can see, but this right here is a bearing. So this is the race and this is the cone. So it tightens up by this thing pushing down. Now if you have too much of a paper gasket in there, it's not gonna push down on enough. Maybe that's what's going on, I don't know. I'm gonna investigate into it further, keep tearing it down, but I figured as long as I'm at this point, see, look how thick of a paper gasket I put on this thing when I was rebuilding it for the Coleman. That's pretty thick. I don't know if it's enough to make it that loose, but it could be. So we're gonna keep going through this thing. Torn down further, this is what she looks like. This is why it's a little different. It's kind of like a wheel bearing, I said. It's got these two opposite conical bearings and they press against each other. Now, this all looks in really good shape. The bearings seem to be in really good shape. A true testament to oil-bathed bearings. This is the drive shaft. This is the shifter, the rail for the shift forks. Now, what's not cool. Oh, by the way, to get this whole assembly out of this thing, you have to basically turn it upside down and drive on the back of this shaft lightly with a hammer, and that'll push this outer race for the bearing. Will pop out and it'll all come out. Anyway, down in here, they're the same bearings in the top and the bottom. The problem is two things that are going to cause this thing to leak. One, obviously, well, let's say three. Let's throw this paper in here. I did this when I was rebuilding it. Never do it again. But that's one thing we're working with. I think that's too much clearance for it to push the bearings down tight. And possibly that caused this next thing. Down in here, the bottom bearing where the race tightens in, it should be a press fit. It is wallered out. And that bearing race was just kind of flopping around in there. That's a problem. What I'm gonna have to do is probably get some machine work done. But the Coleman right now is my daily driver, so I actually have to run some errands with it later tonight. So I'm gonna try to put this thing back together and see if I can't get it to work. If not, I'll just have to figure out some other transportation. Oh, and the third thing, look at that. That thing really needs to be sleeved. Like, it is overdue, bro. So that's not gonna help sealing anything. It should still seal if the thing was riding straight, but I think with all the wallering and stuff, it's worn out excessively. So I'm gonna have to get my guy to sleeve this. But this isn't a part that I can do right now, so I'm gonna see if I can't get these bearings to tighten up before we have to do some more machine work on this thing. I've got this cleaned off, got this cleaned off down to bare metal. I scraped it with a razor, so should be the tightest tolerance I can get between these two surfaces. Now I've got to load the bearings in here, load the shaft back in, and push it down with this and see if it gets tighter. Now, this is gonna have to get serviced before I use a four-wheel drive or really get into it that much more. I'll replace these seals because I have a bunch of them, but that obviously needs to be machined. This needs to be machined or just replaced if I can find another one. And I'll show you why. Look at this bearing. That's terrible. And there's like small metal flakes that I cleaned out of here. So this is not a viable option anymore, but just to get this oil leak stopped until I can get to that point, we're just gonna try to see if we can get it a little tighter. If it works, it works. If not, I'll just have to bolt it together and roll it to somewhere where it can sit. So that said, let's see if we can get this thing tighter. So I drove the other race in upside down. You saw that. Put this in. Now I tapped this race down with a hammer, and this thing is really tight. It feels great. So the question is if that's enough to get it that tight. So really the only way to find that out is to kind of loosen that up. Now that I know that it will tighten up even with that wallered out race in the bottom. Now if this thing will tighten up and press it down like that, then I know it's enough. Otherwise, what I'll have to do is I'll have to get this surface ground down a little bit, take like a couple thousandths off it, just to make sure it's pressing down on that top race enough to get it nice and tight. So in the meantime, that has to get machined. That needs a sleeve on it. That'll take care of most of this, but really that bearing on the inside, I guess I'm gonna have to have my guy either sleeve that or get an oversized bearing or something going on. I bet he can probably just sleeve it and mill it out. But he'd have to do the outside edge too, because that's also the same size bearing. So anyway, fun stuff. Wish it didn't happen, but here we are. So what I'm gonna do now to test this, the tolerance on this, is I gotta drive this back out and then put that on it and tighten it and see the side play I get on this thing. All right, so I don't need to drive this all the way out. I just tapped it out, maybe about a 1/4 inch, maybe an 1/8, I guess. My eyes are bad. So anyway, so now I just pop that on there, see, and we got a gap now, so that's good. It shows that it's not wallered out, or the spec is so far off that it's that much different. So I'll just run some bolts around it and tighten it down. We'll see what it does. All right, tighten that down. So now we got to see, it's still got fairly significant side play, and that's probably from that bearing in the bottom, to be honest. I could, you know, feasibly deck this a couple thou just to get it tighter, but really I'm just going against that bearing. So what I'm going to do in the meantime is I'm going to drive the bearings down by a hammer. Hopefully it'll hold them a little tighter. I'll remove the front drive shaft and just keep that off for now, and I'll seal up the rest of this with silicone. No more paper on this thing. Replace all the seals, replace all the gaskets with just RTV, and I guess I'll get this thing put back together. As long as I have this thing out of the truck, I figured I'd take it all the way apart, because in case somebody's working on one of these, maybe it'll help you to see it apart before you tear yours down. This is a shifter linkage. This is just an anchor, and this is the shifter rail. This is a poppet ball. After you service this thing, the inside of the thing will be dry, so you've got to add a few tablespoons of lubricant in here after you service it. We'll do that, but I'm going to take this apart so you can see what it looks like. All right, nuts removed on the shift lever here. The shifter rail, like I was saying, this is an anchor. Pull it off. Anchor's just a stud there. And here's where you put the lubricant, but you can see one of your poppet ball divots there, and this is where the ball poppet is, the indent on the shifter. So pull this apart. Sometimes the spring is hard to grab, it was kind of jammed in there. So now there's nothing pushing against this poppet ball, but now we got to pull the shifter fork before we can pull this out. Shift rail removed. So you got your spring for the ball, the poppet ball. Got your shifter fork. Goes in with the nub facing forwards when it goes in, so it would be like going in like this. And where's the poppet ball? We got that Allen wrench with the keeper for the shifter fork. We got the poppet ball, which goes underneath this spring. So that's the housing, man. It's pretty simple, and really the reason that you have to have these two coned bearings instead of just roller bearings is because this thing is floating freely inside this little housing. Unlike a transmission or a transfer case, when you have your gears with like counter shafts and everything's rolling in straight lines, this thing has to support itself perfectly straight. And as we've learned today, if it's not completely adjusted correctly, it kind of eats itself up. So I'm going to put this all back together, seal it up, clean it up, dry it off so I can put some RTV on it, then go out and clean off the transfer case as well as I can, and then I'm going to glue her back together on there. In the meantime, I'll basically set a day where I can tear this thing apart and take this to my machinist, take that to my machinist. I've got a parts T32 coming in pretty soon, so maybe I can grab a temporary piece off of that and just replace this whole front, which would be really handy. I'd like to keep the original transfer case just because of the history of the truck. So I don't think that's an insurmountable goal. It's just going to take a little bit of work to maintain it here. So anyway, I'm gonna put it back together and see what we got. So putting this thing back together, I already got it bolted on and siliconed and everything. Shaft is still tight. So this T32, there are plates in the cab and on the transfer case that recommend 90 weight SAE 90, which is a GL1 gear lube. It recommends 90 weight below freezing. It recommends 140 weight above freezing, or else you'll void the warranty. Now I don't want to void the warranty on this because Coleman's pretty hard to get a hold of. So I'm putting 140 in it. I think I'd be fine with 90. 90 is what I run in the S160. That one calls for 90 weight. I'm gonna keep running 140 in this one until I can tear it completely down again, redo all the seals, redo all the bearings and everything, and just make sure everything's A1 top notch. So 140, I got a bucket of it here. I'm going to oil this first to take it easier on the seals. They need all the help they can get, especially with a surface like that. I don't want to just shove it in there dry. And then I got to put some lubricant in this top hole like I was talking about before, because it's been serviced, it's dry. And then once that's done, I'll add lubricant to the rest of the transfer case. All right, so I'm gonna bend this cotter pin up a little bit, but not a lot. This is not getting a shaft put back on it. I just need this thing to stay here and not fall off. The front wheel drive won't be used until I can get the bearing surface machined in here. So I'm not worried about this thing. All this cotter pin needs to do is make sure this nut doesn't come off and that this stays in place. This won't be engaged. I might not even add the linkage back onto it. Actually, I'll probably just take it off. I guess another thing I wanted to say too is that I've been going over in my head all the times I've used a four-wheel drive in this, and I've really only used the four-wheel drive in this truck once. And that was when we were crawling around in the video, crawling up to the Tequila Caves. This thing probably had power to it for 3 miles, maybe, tops. And then after that, it probably just ran, just idled with the shaft turning it about 10 miles until we got back to the highway. So I think a lot of this damage in here happened before I had the truck, but no matter what, the damage is done and I've got to fix it. It's a bummer, but it is what it is. So I'm gonna add the fluid in this thing, even though it's not gonna get used. I wanna say something quick about adding lubricant to this. Obviously, after servicing it, you're supposed to add lubricant, a few tablespoons to this. Now, one reason you do that is because there's very tightly machined gears on this end that this thing bolts to, and it's gonna take a while for that lubricant to work through them to come into here. So if you just drop this thing into a truck, added a lubricant to the back and ran it, especially if you didn't have lockout hubs or anything, this thing would start spinning right away and dry on bearings. The other reason is because if you don't fill this up and then you add a bunch to this, eventually it's going to come into this and your level is going to be lower than it should in the back. Just a few little things about a T32 that you should keep in mind if you're filling one. Anyway, let's give her the stuff. Oh, the HOA is going to be stoked. So that's it. I'm going to take this front drive shaft off, put it back into storage. Yeah, and then I'll get this machined when I can. Like I said, it's a bummer, but could be a lot worse. All right, I'll catch you all next time.